while most of that countrymen were saying African people had no history, who are the whites who stood out and said they do have a history, and this is the history? That's what it's all about. But first, I want to do what family people do. I want to give an account of myself to you. What have I been doing since you see me? Excuse me, laugh. Now that I can barely see you, while my general health is seemingly improved. But the progressive glaucoma is not improved because the two operations control the pressure in my eyes, where it lowered the eyesight, and it never came back. So all I know is that there are a lot of friendly faces there, and I felt very good to enter here and see Dr. Show's door, who's one of my kind of people I adopted proteges. I'm always being a mentor of people who had to ask me to be their mentor, but they don't seem to object. But to know that she's in the audience with her child and that her family is functioning well. First, I want to let you know some of the things I've been doing outside of the city than within the city. Outside of the city, I've been traveling a great deal. I've made several lecture tours, and I'm starting another one this weekend in Detroit. But I went to Florida and Atlanta, but I want to tell you about Florida and the sentiment in Florida. In Miami, African people are trying to be replaced. And they have decided they weren't going to be replaced. I toured through the so-called riot areas of Miami, and the brothers seem to be doing something right for once. They did not find a single black store. Not a single one. The Haitian community is doing well with their little stores and their shops. They didn't touch a Haitian store. They didn't even go to the community, except to congratulate them for doing a whole lot of things that local blacks had not done. They didn't. Miami has a large Bahamian population. My wife's Bahamian. I made the mistake of calling her a second-hand West Indian. I won't do that again. The Bahamians, they're so close to the United States, the rest of the West Indians don't consider them as being apart. And then they have not only Bahamian restaurants, Bermuda restaurants, Bahamian restaurants, then they have Caribbean restaurants. You have a human laboratory in Florida. But America, in its vicious anti-communism, which sometimes is a waste of the taxpayers' money, in their endorsement of Cuba, they built up a city that the Cubans have taken over. Now the Cubans are bossing some of the people who brought them here. And the Cubans are showing their colors. At first, there were no black Cubans. Now that the black Cubans has come to Miami, the black Cubans suffer the same way as the black Americans, even at the hands of the black Cubans. You have to understand, racism does not stop at the door of communism, socialism, or other kind of isms. It remains. Because until you can pass the taxi cab test, you might as well stop kidding yourself. The supreme test is who downtown can get the taxi. That separates the citizen from the subject. The citizen can get a taxi. The subject has to wait. Finally, one time after about 21 past you, a brother comes by because the brother knows you be thankful for getting uptown. You gonna give him a nice tip. The brother got no word. He can look at you and tell you even have enough strength to rob him. He's not insecure. Okay, now in Miami, the brothers burned down stores of a furniture store owned by an Arab who's been cheating them, and grocery stores owned by a Cuban who had been cheating them. They did not touch one black store. They're learning something about strategy. We're not knocking down our communities only to have people rebuild them and charge us for it. Now, I wish the riot had not occurred, but these things are generally forced. But in Florida, where you have a human laboratory in as much as you've got regular Caribbean people, Jamaicans and Trinidadians they've got their own community. You got the Nasuvians and the Grand Bahamians, my wife's people, and each one have their own restaurant system, own the grocery system. I went to Bahama restaurant. I thought I was just going to a regular Caribbean restaurant, and this is a Bahama restaurant. I said, oh, what's the difference? You all got peas and rice. Taste our peas and rice. Nothing to do with the peas and rice of those up-island people who don't know how to fix peas and rice. I didn't argue one way or the other. But you know what? They have improved on peas and rice. I think because everywhere I go to my own people. I spoke in one church, two churches, and in the second church, the minister had gone to Angola on the invitation of Savimbi. And he thought Savimbi was the president of Angola, and he addressed him as the president of Angola, was displaying the presents he brought back. And his trip to Angola was financed by local fascist-minded Cubans. We fall into a whole lot of traps without knowing what we're falling into. Now, years ago, when Idi Amin was inviting blacks to come to Uganda and be citizens, Roy Innes took advantage of it. Soon after that, Roy Innes began to advocate Black American unity with UNITA and Savimbi. This would have been disaster, because I say no African people in the Western world should ever lift arms against another African people. And I don't know why I wrote the only letter to the Amsterdam News, and they published it and published Innes' reply, saying that, look, we cannot be recruited in the West to support Africans who are being supported by the United States and South Africa. If you're being supported by the United States and South Africa, then you are out to destabilize Africa, and you're an enemy of Africa. When you think of that, a black preacher from Florida would go there and bring back and display all the presents and he got from Savimbi, including a pure ivory hatchet, decorative hatchet. And I don't mean imitation ivory. This is pure ivory. You don't get much of it anymore because they stop people from killing elephants. So pure ivory is something very rare. That one piece he had would have cost over $3,000 on the open market. He's displaying his cap and all the different things he got from UNITA, which proves that he is politically naive about what is happening in Africa and what is happening in Southern Africa. But it was a good thing to go and to be on the spot and to ask the brothers what did happen, and to know from their point of view, other than the point of view of the mass media. The mass media missed the point in total. The black position in Miami was strengthened in the final analysis. But that don't mean they still don't have trouble. They do have trouble. Here's a city where the Cubans have done something I never thought anybody would do. They've taken the dry goods and the department store business away from the Jews. And they control it. Economically, they have control of the city. And another thing the Cubans have done, which we should be very careful to try to do or make better use of what we have in this regard. They've taken over a university in Florida, Florida Memorial. Florida Memorial is, from all intentions and purpose, a Cuban university where they speak Spanish and all the high officials are Cubans. We never colonize other people's property and turn it in direction, turning it into our own. We are very kind and humane people, and sooner or later we'll need some kind of protection. But we have to toughen up for the century ahead. That don't mean we must lose our humanity, but we must recognize the fact that in this world you are not going to exist free without some form of defense. And what I don't like to hear, nobody don't have much hitting strength left anyway. Nobody's going to be free in this world unless somebody hits somebody. I regret that this is true, but I'm not the one that made it true. I've been over 50 years on this line. I'm tired. I like to get off the line. But I get stimulated sometimes when I face a black audience. On a tour of North Carolina, I went to North Carolina at Charlotte, University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And this is the way I get to serve black institutions. I went to University of North Carolina at Charlotte. They paid me $1,000 and plane fare and lodging. I delivered a decent, honorable lecture at Charlotte. Then I go to J.C. Smith, a black school, and lecture for nothing. Now the people at Charlotte, the white folks, some of them came to my lecture, J.C. Smith, and they asked us that we were very satisfied with your lecture at Charlotte. You seem to have given the best lecture over here at J.C. Smith. He's a little black religious school, barely struggling to keep his doors open. When I looked at that, I saw all of that energy and all of those black faces and all of those black young people. That was a new energy, new impotence. I pushed the script aside, you know. I got something to say to you that I don't say to other people. We must again get into the custom of managing nations. We must get back into the custom of not being dependent on anybody, on anything. We must make everything we need, from a toothpick, telephone pole, to a train, and any kind of communication. And we must remember what I keep reminding you. 200 years ago, the Japanese did not have a good wheelbarrow. It was in the 1880s that Perry kicked open the door. 1905, they had built enough ammunition that they could take on Russia. And they took on Russia and won. When they turned to the rest of Asia and said that you don't need the European to rule over you, you should kick him out. And then in the 1930s, when the Asians did not respond to kicking out the Europeans, the Japanese said, if you don't kick out the Europeans, then maybe I'll come over and rule you. They kept telling the Asians, you don't need the white man. And when finally, after the war, the white men were too weak to hold our country, they turned to the Japanese and said, maybe I don't need you either. Maybe I can take over myself from this point. All right, now, I left and I went to Atlanta, where I stayed at a very noted black hotel that I nearly always stay because the breakfasts are good, the food is just good. And it's better instead of going downstairs, if you just all have to sit up in your room, you get it better quicker for some reason. You got the best room service of any in a hotel I know about. The quickest too. All right. At Pascal's, I ran into a meeting where Andy Young was attending. And when people get so big that they don't remember you when both of you didn't have matching shoes, I don't push them. So I let them come to me. I don't rush after them to ask for favors. So Henrik came to you in the city. You didn't call me, and how's your son? Our respective sons used to be playmates when Andy was at the United Nations. He would pick my son up in the limousine, and the two of them would go out together. He would father them one Saturday. I would father them the next Saturday. But that's really friendly, family connection. And his daughter used to come to my house and get her homework. I mean, so we were that friendly. And when people become mayors of cities and approve, I don't know about what attitude they have, so I don't push myself on them anymore. So he wanted to know why I didn't call him. Then he said that I got a little problem. This is the 50th anniversary of Gone with the Wind. I'm the mayor of Atlanta. They're going to do a special edition of Gone with the Wind. And I have to write the preface. What can I say? I said that you can be gracious and say something that will please them, that in the final analysis it will be so worded you wouldn't have said nothing. You wouldn't have said nothing. So he was happy about that, the fact that he's partner over that book. Then he said that he planned to run for governor. I wonder what kind of support you got from the churches. Never mind the black vote, the white vote. So many whites are dissatisfied with whites. Some of them going to throw their vote to you just to spite other whites. That's a margin. If you get the white margin and a solid black vote, you might squeak in. Although I would prefer for you to run in Mississippi where you got a numerical chance. You don't have to squeak in Mississippi. If all the blacks in Mississippi voted, then it's a run-in. Because they're 48% of the total population. Because you can get a governor or a senator out of Mississippi anytime they make up their mind that's what they're going to do. So it was a good meeting. Although I don't know how to gauge middle-class blacks, never been a part of that group myself, and don't know what they're middle from what. I don't know. But something is in the middle, that means you got to have a lower and an upper. I don't know the upper. So I know the middle from what. But you have to handle with nice gloves, and and you can't hurt that feeling because you never know when you're going to need one, and you have to go through your act of Tom into a Tom. If you want something for well-placed blacks, sometimes you got to go Tom to them or you won't get it. So you never know which one of these Toms you're going to ultimately have to Tom to, so you treat them with halfway decent, with nice club. So that connection taught me a little bit about the Atlanta scene. There are two excellent bookstores in Atlanta, both better than the ones we have here in Brooklyn and in New York, and New York City. The Shrine of the Black Madonna. Here's a church complex that has an entire block of buildings. The church, the school, the recreation, the computer center, all of this, one block, and got images in the church reflecting the blackness of Jesus and the blackness of the angels. Because they said that they asked a question: of all the African people in the world, brown, black, and otherwise, who died before Christ, you mean to tell me none of them got to heaven and all that, and only the white angels got up there? So they painted themselves some black and brown angels, all kind of angels, all kind of different races. They didn't rule out whites. They just ruled other people in. And this is really what the lecture is about. Not taking white people out of history, but putting black people in their proper place. Once you put black people in their proper place, you can leave white people in. You can let Paul Revere stay in the American Revolution. He made that ride for a very good purpose. The good purpose is stated, but there was a secondary purpose that's not stated. He was a bootlegger, and he was also informing the bootleggers hide that stuff before the British put a tax on it. But many times the incidentals of history get left out of history. Like the Queen of Sheba and Solomon, who was not much of a gentleman. He's invited a queen, one of Africa's finest queens, to visit him. She visited him because Tamaran, the Ethiopian commercial czar, had told her that Solomon had bought a lot of red gold from Ethiopia and a lot of things for his buildings. And each time he go to Solomon, Solomon give him some wise saying instead of paying the debt. He said, go to Judea and see if you can collect the money. And while you're there, incidentally, check out his wisdom. The incidentally became a part of history, and the fact that the woman was going to collect the national debt of her country got left out of history. The incidentally could be played around with. Because you can play around with that because you can deal with Solomon and his so-called wisdom. I'm one of the people who's not a Solomon fan, you know. I think he wasn't a gentleman. You invite a royal woman to your house, a queen of Ethiopia, who's trained. I mean, her entourage was so large and so long, was 3 miles wide long. That's the attendants, the porters, and her bodyguard. Her private bodyguard larger than the armed forces of Judea. Her country 30 times the size of Judea. She would not go there and say to anyone, I'm black but comely, you daughters of Jerusalem. She wouldn't say that. There was a period when nobody apologized for color and nobody boasted of color. Solomon gives her dinner, gets too much salt in the dinner. She gets up at night to get some water and he assaults her. He don't sound like no gentleman to me. I'm perfectly willing to leave Solomon in history, but not as a man of wisdom or integrity, or a man who had enough gentlemanly charm to treat a royal African woman the way a royal African woman needed to be treated. Okay, now, I'm saying because people emphasize what they want to emphasize, but we are approaching the 500-year anniversary of Christopher Columbus' alleged discovery of America. And I maintain he discovered absolutely nothing. How are we going to celebrate? Blacks are all geared to celebrate. The Caribbean islands are all geared to celebrate. What are they celebrating? Because had this man been kind to the labor supply in the Caribbean islands, It wouldn't have been necessary to bring Africans here. That Africans came out of Africa to the so-called New World. Their first encampment was the Caribbean islands. We have misunderstood the Caribbean islands, and the Caribbean people have misunderstood the Caribbean islands. Because they spent so much time saying, I'm different from those other people, they quite forget that the incubator, the rehearsal for slavery was in the Caribbean islands. And there it was harder than in the United States because they broke the slaves there for the American market. Later on, certain circumstances, plus the fact that they became the majority on the island, and the lazy Englishman who was brought to do certain technical labor didn't work out, and they became the craftsmen, the shoemakers, the ship repair people, the armorers, the ammunition repair people. They repaired the sugar mills, and they developed a skillful class that was not only skillful but so needed that they had to lighten the load on that class, and that created a Caribbean free man ahead of the creation of a similar class in the United States, especially in New England. Why am I going all of this way to come back to the preservers of African history? Because in preserving African history, it is something that I study all of the time. It is a consistent thing with me, like breathing, forever inquiring into things. And this is why I regret that I do not have the visual facility that I used to have. And one of the reasons why is that I like to examine documents. I like to freshen up things. And I like to forever be poking in corners of libraries, digging up books that most people haven't read. And even if they knew about them, they're too difficult to read, or they think they're too difficult to read. Because the mission of getting proper information on my people in the world has been an overriding permission of my life, to search for the basic truth. I had 50 years or more of direct relationship to communists and socialists. And when the final break came, it came over my pursuit of the absolute truth. And even if it goes against Karl Marx, what Karl Marx has said, if it's the truth, it is the truth. I'm not against Marx. What he said about class and economics is applicable to Europe. It is not applicable to the rest of the world, because in the rest of the world, culture and religion prevails over class and economics. And if you want to approach the economic condition in these countries, you got to approach it through an understanding of that culture and that religion. I've explained to you why a big nation, an old nation like China, had a falling out with a young European nation like Russia. Not because they disagreed ideologically, but they differed culturally. You don't let Junior come in the house and be the boss when he hasn't gone through those paces that gives him that knowledge to rule. He's not to rule. He hasn't been trained to rule. He has been trained to understand. Now, one more item and I'm going to go to the subject. I've been in the community a lot. The last 3 weeks I have visited a different school each week. And I am encouraged each time. And this morning I visited the school 3 blocks from my house, John B. Ruswan School, 135th Street and 5th Avenue. The questions that our young people are asking, the inquiries that they are making, the challenges that they are throwing down to you, tell me something that encourages me in spite of all the nonsense about crack. No children on crack can ask me questions like that intelligently, and they were doing it intelligently. We have underneath, and after all of these crack dealers and crack sellers, it's over publicized. We have a strong and young crop of young people coming up who will do business and do it right. We are not lost. But we have to nurture that crop. We have to train that crop. We have to encourage that crop. We got kids who said that, all right, so I came from a one-parent family. I'm not going to let that throw me. So I'll do what I can with what I have. I heard an interview with Thurgood Marshall a few months ago, and we said, someone asked, in the final analysis, what do you think people should say of you? He said, they should say he did the best he could with what he had. It was an evening when I was a little bit depressed. I had a whole lot of new books and I could barely read them or even read the titles because I'd lost so much eyesight. I roamed through my book like a ancient wino roaming through a wine cellar, sipping here, sipping there, reading a paragraph here. It's one of the great joys of my existence to go through my own library that's practically on every floor in my house. Reading a little bit from each book sometimes, just picking one up and remembering the last time I opened it. And when I began to think that I can't do that anymore, I can't go upstairs and locate in my civil rights library, locate the documents on the pamphlets at once. I have to feel my way now. Probably was on that shelf, or maybe not. You know, probably I left it some other place. The best A papers of my students at Cornell, some of the finest papers I've ever read coming from. I can't do that anymore. So I was a little depressed, and I heard this interview, and Thurgood Marshall said that in the final analysis, just tell them I hope they say he did the best he could with what he had left. I said, well, there ain't nothing else for me to do. Got my basic health left. I have a phenomenal memory left. I can still walk. I can still lecture. I can still do a whole lot of things. Within this year, I have finished 3 books. I'm not ready for the boneyard. And what has enhanced me and made me feel good about myself, my community, and my people is that in these last 3 weeks, going from one school to the other, and finding black teachers on the case, and white teachers trying to get on the case, and white teachers beginning to understand if you don't do some teaching now, you ain't gonna make it in no black schools, because these black kids, in all their curiosity, they ain't asking no mild, neat questions anymore. This morning, a kid got up in class and said that about the word African American and black and color. I'm black and my classmate sitting next to me is light. How did both of us get to be Afro-American?
Yeah.
Now I got to explain the fact that the slave ships didn't bring any African Americans. The slave ships didn't bring any Caribbean. The slave ships didn't bring any high yellows or low yellows. Most of us left Africa on the same boat, in the same color. One ship dropped some off in the West Indies, came over and dropped us off over here. We lack the ability to protect our women on the shores of Africa. We lack the ability to protect them on the ship. We lack the ability to protect them once they got off of the ship. and certain liberties were taken when we had not the ability to protect them. Certain liberties were taken. Certain inept people began to practice on them for that sexuality, or that misconception of sexuality. And they began a process called bastardization. This process almost destroyed the Haitian Revolution. It has started the development of modern Jamaica. Oh, then in Jamaica would look you dead in the eye and say no. Push Garvey out the first time, push him out the second time. Because that group was so strong, they could call the tune. Same group that elected a Boston hustler as their prime minister. Now that they made a drastic change, it's not so drastic, because the one thing Mandela knows from his father, because his father was a greater nationalist than he was. He was just an arrogant black Englishman. But his father really knew and loved Jamaica from a nationalistic point of view, and realized that there would be an emergence in Jamaica of people other than the Light Brigade who's going to give Jamaica a new lease on life politically. And Mandela understands one thing: he may be the last of the big mulatto rulers of Jamaica. He don't regret it, because he said a set of circumstances has made Jamaica the most stratified island in the Caribbean, one of the most stratified nations in the world. And he says, I am the result of it. But all he is doing is to prove it to the group that though he is almost white, in heart and in commitment, he is as Jamaican as any other Jamaican. So that in the final analysis he can say, paraphrasing Othello, I have done the state some good, and they know it, in spite of everything. And that is true. It's some misguided concepts he had to work out, had some misguided diplomatic concepts he had to work out, and he may not have worked all of them out. But he can see now in a clearer light than he ever saw before, because he knows the danger zone. And you know, if you're going to go near them, he's got to go with protection. Now, all of this is a preface to the speech that I will now begin. What have we done to preserve the history of African people in the world? I would like to take a look at some of the non-African preservers of our history, and to dispel the idea that all white people have been against our history and against our proper place in history. Now, we like to tell a whole lot of stories about whites, and sometimes it's an easy out. So they did it. But as a matter of truth, all the time Europeans were distorting African history, there were groups of Europeans saying, no, that is not true. And this started in the ancient times. And we must go over now. We must now read some of these ancient texts. And most of them have been translated into English. We must now start with the first European eyewitnesses to Africa. The ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, the ancient Persians. These first eyewitnesses spoke well of Africa. The first eyewitness to leave us a good account was Herodotus. Herodotus came to Africa around 450 BC. Though Egypt was in decline by then, had been occupied by a whole lot of people, and the Iranians were still there, bastardizing the country, destroying the statues.
He said then that Africa has more to offer in decline than Greece had to offer on its way up. And he traveled. He saw that Africa, now almost torn down by foreigners, still had more to offer than a young Europe. And he said that when he traveled from east to west, south to north, he said the tint of complexion of the Ethiopians are the same as that of the same. But he said the tint of complexion of the Libyans sometimes look like dark-skinned Romans. In other words, there was a likeness in the complexion of the Libyans, but they were not less African. And he also said that what made him a great reporter is that when the Africans told him something that he didn't believe, he said, the Africans tell me this, but I tend not to believe it. Now these eyewitnesses, these early preservers of African history, and who put it down, Herodotus, the 2-volume work, the best is the 1-volume Herodotus, by Rollison's work is the best. If you got plenty of time, get the 4-volume Rollison with the field notes. He did more than a translation. He did an interpretation of every chapter. Many people have preserved our history when we were not in a position to do so. This was followed by both Romans and Greeks. Pliny the Elder, Pliny the Younger, and another writer who wrote a book called Natural History, Diodorus of Sicily, known as Diodorus Siculus. His natural history gives you the history of African people before the coming of the Europeans. And with the coming of the Europeans, a great African scholar, with the coming of the Romans, began to first teach the Romans African history. When he saw they were making poor use of it, he began to distort it himself. His name was Manetho. And when you go back, you want to know the ancient dynasties of ancient Egypt, and in that chronological sequence, we go back to Manetho. Now, Dr. Ben and other writers have preserved all of this. Sheikh Diop has preserved all of this. John Jackson in Chicago has preserved all of this, and John Jackson has written what he said is his last novel, and every time John Jackson gets in a serious illness, he calls people in to write his obituary. Well, I've done all I can now. Farewell, carry on. Then he go live another 10 years. John Jackson has written a book is coming out soon called The Ages of Gold and Silver. A black man's interpretation of the whole world, not just Africa. Africa's in that in its proper place. But John Jackson has looked at all the societies of the world. He said that's his swan song, his magnum opus. He won't go any further. I leave it to you young people. Now John Jackson could be 83. I've attended his 79th birthday 3 times because he said he's 79th and holy. John Jackson is from one of the light-skinned families in North Carolina. He, now that his hair is snow white, he looks more like a Georgia cracker than ever. He goes to his home in Chicago. Little black toughs who never read any of his books know that this man has made the greatest inquiry into the religious significance of history of any man alive. Know nothing about his work on the African origins of the legends of the Garden of Eden, the pagan origins of the Christ myth, when he traced the Christ story through 26 civilizations, all 1,000 miles apart. His African origins of Christianity. In his book, he came out a few years ago, no, just 2 years ago, Christianity Before Christ, when he showed that every element that went into Christianity existed in other religions before Christianity. He's not against Christianity, but he's dealing with its formal beginning. And that what the African created was a great body of spirituality. You must make a clear distinction between spirituality and religion. Because spirituality is bigger than religion. Either religion comes out of spirituality or religion is nothing. So they extracted from African spirituality different concepts that they used to create their religion. I'm talking about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They created for the world a God complex, a God concept different from the Africans. The Africans had no gods of vengeance, no God of doom. We gave the world its first salvation-oriented religion. And everything was extracted from that. The African created no God that cursed anybody, for least of all for laughing at his father's nakedness after he's had too much wine. Least of all. So the Noah story is really Jewish folklore. And because black people will not deal with folklore, and most black people don't know how to read the Bible, if they read it, they would get much more out of it. But if they stop saying all of it is the truth, they could find the essential part that is the truth, and separate it from the part that is the truth to the part that is folklore. They can understand that many times stories are told to illustrate a point, and if the illustration is true, the story need not be true. But it is told as a teaching lesson. In an age when people did not read widely, stories were told, teaching was made through parables. But if the parable you use to illustrate the truth illustrates the truth well, and if you get the point, the illustration need not be true. All right, now, the Africans were the first preservers of history, because long before Herodotus, long before Pliny the Elder, long before Diodorus Siculus, long before these ancient writers, long before Homer discovered the Africans as a great mysterious people in the Odyssey and the Iliad, long before that, the Africans had written books saying where they came from. We came from the south. They had said that we came from the upper part of the Nile. We came from the headwaters of the Nile, where the great god Hathor dwells, near the mountain of the moon, meaning Kilimanjaro. The Africans had already said that. The foreigners came and discovered that. And with their discovery of this African fact, they began to make the wrong use of it. It seems inconceivable to them that the Africans could have built the pyramids, and yet they have not yet proved that anybody else did the pyramids. How could Europe build the pyramids? Because when the pyramids were built, there was no Europe. How could he build a pyramid in someone else's country before he built a decent pair of shoes in his country? Or a house with a window? Now, these ancient Africans who preserved our history, preserved our ancient spirituality. When people broke it up into denominations, they began to put one denomination against the other. I wish some of the brothers would actually read the Quran. I brought one here one night, and the brothers who sing it for the first time, Muslim brothers too, sing it for the first time, so this is the Quran. They've been reading some other book, Hadith or some other supplement to Islam. This is the real one. Now, My main point is that these ancient visitors to Africa spoke of Africa in glowing terms. And now the Roman historian, well, the Romans were never as brilliant as the Greeks. Still are not. The Romans could fight well, he could dress well. But really now, he really wasn't a great thinker. Still are not. But the Romans, the Greeks outsmarted themselves because they were so smart and intellectual, they thought they didn't need any army. You know, a bunch of Roman thugs go there and beat the hell out of them and took over that country. That's still happening. Any gangster can overpower any priest. Does that make the gangster better than the priest? The priest didn't think he needed any power, so he didn't carry a gun. So you have to think about who took over what, who, and what the circumstances of this takeover. Now we began to get a record of the entry of foreigners into Africa. Dr. Ben, who's now teaching in Egypt at El-Azhar, something I thought was terribly dangerous for him to do, because I don't think the Arabs will ever admit the truth about their entry and their destruction. He's discovering something which I have suspected all along, and so other scholars. When they burned the famous library at Alexandria, they took most of the books out first. And some of these books were hidden. Ben has begun to find some of these old books. Wow. I asked him now, he was close to me as a brother. I said, look, brother, now, kind of dangerous territory. You go in, the Arabs are mean people. They're the most corrupt element within Islam, and they use Islam any kind of way to make their power point. You're going into dangerous territory. Some doors have been opened to me that have been closed for over 1,000 years. He's found actual statues and pictures of the Hittite, the first invaders of Africa. He looked behind the statues. See how the back of their head looked. Found the dreadlocks. These were not white people. These were Eastern blacks invading North African blacks. Now, this is because there's so many small things we do not do. Years ago in the Harlem History Club, Wilson Huggins was sent to Geneva to look after our affairs. We were enlightened enough to raise enough money to send Willis Huggins to Geneva. We were making less than 20 a week. I was second salad man at a cafeteria, and I was making $18.50 a week. Wearing tweeds, imported from England, cost me $2 a week until I paid my $50 and got my tweed. I don't mean no imitation tweed. I wore real tweed. No shoes that I had to shine. That was my suede period. 1850. The great salad for that day in the late 30s. My main point is that we were enlightened enough on those small salaries to support Africans in missionary schools in Africa. Well, sometimes the tuition was $30 a year. And we would adopt one child, some two, and we get the money, got that money there. A great Ugandan named Ernest Kalabala was here then, and he was married to a black American girl, and that kind of Pan-African marriage sometimes makes out for the better for both of us when they get the brother hung up with a good black American sister, and she got whispering in his ears, some things get together that otherwise wouldn't have gotten together. Now, my main point here in the focus in telling you that there are many things in our own life that we have missed. That when Henrik was in Geneva and the Young Turks took over the lecture series, John Jackson delivered the first lecture, and we did not have tape recorders and very few people took notes. John Jackson's first lecture was something nobody believed. They enjoyed the lecture, but nobody believed it. The lecture was The Black Man as an Imperialist, when we ruled other people. You don't conceive of yourself as having once invaded and ruled over other people. You have not even read about what we did in Spain and the humanity of it. You have read that the Muslims in Spain were more tolerant than they've ever been since. So tolerant that they would marry more than that customary 4 wives that the Muslims entitled to, and they would let them remain in the Catholic Church. This started an argument between the Africans and the Arabs, and this argument eventually weakened their hold in Spain. Jackson was telling us that there were periods in our history when we were strong enough to take over other people's country, and we never did to other people what they did to us. We never mutilated them. We never took their women without consent of the women. We effected a wedding between their culture and our culture to create an amalgam culture that was a complement to both. This is true if you seriously study Irving Van Sertima's work that came from Columbus, dealing with the Africans in ancient America, but dealing with the Africans in the ancient East, and dealing with the Africans in ancient Europe, and how Africans preserved this, and while now we're beginning to understand things about the African presence in Europe we did not understand before. I did the second lecture, primed myself, read and read, till I got my confidence up. Never forget the lecture. It was called An Inquiry into the Racial Identity of Jesus Christ. When you're 23, you don't know what you don't supposed to inquire into. You open all doors and look at everything. Out of the spirit of that lecture and the desire to know that someone in my hometown was listening to me, I was going up north, and I wasn't little Bubba Clarke anymore. I was John H. Clarke of New York, a published writer. I had about 6 poems published. I was a somebody. I wanted to know if anybody in my hometown read my work. So I wrote a story. I used living people in a fictitious situation, which is not only against the law, it's against the rule. You don't do things like that. But when you're 23 and broke, living in a furnished room while dinner telling you to cost you $3.75 a week, who can hurt you with a lawsuit? Who can? So I wrote this story, The Boy Who Painted Christ Black. The story had been hanging in my mind. The story was totally made up, but I used the name of my 5th grade teacher. I used the name of the principal in high school, in the grammar school, and I used the white superintendent of school. The white superintendent of school wrote me later and said that he had done so much for the colored folks. Why would you say things like that? I had a scene when the white superintendent objected to the picture of Christ being painted black, and I said that, he was pale and etc., but his eyes were the bluest I have ever seen. That was the only lifelike thing about him. He didn't particularly appreciate that caricature, but I was I was beginning to develop as a thinker and began to consider the fact that I was trained by master black teachers for nothing, who never charged me anything. Arthur Schoenberg taught me the interrelationship of our history to the history of the world. Willis and Huggins of the Old History Club taught me the political meaning of history. And from the lectures of William Leo Hansberry at Howard University, I learned the philosophical meaning of history. And you put all of that together, nobody better come up on you with no new shiny PhD. Man, child, go change your diaper. Don't bother me. The point of view is that I was learning not only to preserve our history, I was learning to research others who had preserved our history. I was now looking at books that I never would have read except for my association with John Jackson, Willis and Huggins, Seifert, and J. Rogers. Because I was a willing associate with all these people who never charged me anything, and every time I asked questions, they gave me answers. A curious kids. Now, they led me to read these ancient writers. They led me to inquire into the eyewitness accounts of Europeans in Africa who said in their accounts the Africans were as civilized to the marrow of their bones. And 50 years later, they invented a savage. It had no history. The same Europeans. When people move you out of history, they're trying to oppress you and to make you think that you need to be oppressed. Because you cannot consciously oppress a consciously historical people. Because a consciously historical people will not let it happen. They will look back in their history and remember, I'll produce some generals better than the one you got. I'll produce some armies better than the one you got. I have outfoxed you in history and lived, and I can do it again. I might start doing it now. If you realize how much you meant to the world and how much has been extracted from you in order to make the world, you will walk out of oppression. You won't even have to fight yourself out of it. You just walk out of it. It's finished. It's all over. Oppression, no more. I won't take it no more. You realize your own definition of yourself. One of the things Willis and Huggins taught me is something which he called the Boo theory of history. He said there's so many of us African people in the world, so many of us Asian people, so many of us South Sea Island people, so many of us non-white people in the world. If we ever synchronized our watches, stomped our feet and said boom all at the same time, we would shake the world. The question is, when are we going to come out of this depression? When are we going to start doing something in unison? Stomp our feet and say boom. It'll frighten the whole world. The vibration will shake the earth. There's so many of us to say it. All right, now, with the European discovery of Africa, with that idiot, paranoid fool called Napoleon, who wanted to use Egypt as a jumping off point to take the rest of Africa, he took scientists, anthropologists, paleontologists to Egypt. And he wanted to prove that Egypt was white and Egypt could be the beachhead to conquer the rest of Africa because of the achievement. The Arabs had been there before, and they had tried to mutilate some of the statues they succeeded in mutilating some of the smaller statues. The statues were down low, because they're still doing it. It's hard for you to understand that the Arabs are mutilating the faces of statues right now.
They're all down in the metropolitan.
Right now.
Down on the first floor.
They're mutilating the faces of them. Knocking off the nose. Mutilating the lips. Because the lips and the nose tell you more than anything else ethnically who that person was. But Napoleon brought over a man quite by accident, Count Boney. All the rest of the intellects told Napoleon exactly what he wanted to hear and took the money. Count Boney is from a rich family. Didn't need the money, didn't need Napoleon's goodwill. He wrote a separate report, a dissenting report, well worth reading right now. Went into Asia, went to what is now Ethiopia, compared them with the people in the north, and wrote a little classic work called Ruins of Empire. And he observed that, looking at the slabs of waste from iron mining and Melwe, where the Africans had created what they call the ancient, mistakenly called the ancient Birmingham of Africa, a great steel center. He said, when you behold this evidence, this is the evidence of a people who gave the world its natural laws, now enslaved in America. And his famous quote turned Europe around. But before this, a North African had visited inner West Africa. No, not before this, but this was after this. In the period of the 1500s. And this South African had visited the court of Askia the Great. He has a long, unpronounceable name, but that was a period in history when Europeans captured Arabs and held them for ransom, and the Arabs captured Europeans and held them for ransom. Many times the basic treasury of African states, the money they got in ransom for returning Christians. They would capture the Christian, they would write back to his home, and the people would pay so much money to get him out. But once the Europeans captured an Arab going to visit his relatives in Spain from Tunisia, they turned him over to the Pope because he was intelligent. And he was called Pope Leo. It was Pope Leo. He was called Pope Leo's African. So he became in history as Leo Africanus. The Pope asked him to write a book about what was happening in the Western Sudan, inner West Africa. He wrote an excellent book. It's in English and it still can be read. The translation by an Englishman named Polar, ends with a Y. History and Description of Africa. Some of his descriptions are perfect. He was mentioning a free Africa before European interference. For many of the people spent more money on books than anything else. Had books imported from Southern Europe and from Northern Africa. He was describing an Africa that was free. He was describing the court of one of the last of the truly great African rulers, Askia the Great, Muhammad Abubakar Ituri. And except for having some of the rivers running in the wrong direction, it is an excellent work on Africa of the late medieval period. Now, Africans too did a lot to preserve African history. One being the work of Leo Africus. But the Africans in the Western Sudan who actually lived in that area wrote several works The first one, about 1300, the Tariq al-Fatash, or the history of the Seeker. But the best work and the best known work written during the period of independent African grandeur was the Tariq as-Sudan, Adoramum as-Sudai, a history of the Sudan. Remember, the word Sudan meant black. But the African made no fuss over blackness. You don't make no fuss over blackness in a sea of blackness. Eskimos don't make any fuss over ice. They live in it. The people keep like, is it black? Or what do you mean? In a sea of blackness, you got to proclaim something black when it's all around you. When you believe in a religion that says, I'm my brother's keeper, you don't shout it, because if you say, I'm my brother's keeper, I suspect you don't want to keep him. But if you're your keeper, then don't shout it. Just go ahead and keep it. That's one thing that separates African religion, African spirituality from organized religion. They've created a document around it. They created a dogma around it. And they proclaim the dogma. But often they betray the dogma and the theory. I dare a white man to be Christian. I dare him to be Democratic. Just 24 hours. Try it, 24 hours. He's finished. Whatever he's doing is finished. That's the end of that. Because he's built a structure of murder and stealing. Violating his neighbor's wife. Built an entire structure, power structure on that. If he stopped there, he'd be a poor man. Wall Street is nothing but a thieves' den. A legitimatized thieves' den. Only thieves wear white collars. And some of the thieves have chauffeurs. They're not less thieves. All right, now, I'm pointing to literature created by the Africans that told you of the true greatness of African independent states before the interference. The finest work on this period is done by a Frenchman. His work is Timbuktu the Mysterious. And if you forgive the modesty, I think one of the finest short pieces on it was my article, The University of Timbuktu at St. Corey, a neglected aspect of African intellectual history. That was published in the Journal of Western Black Studies. There are a lot of good work on this period, on this era of Africa, independent Africa before the slave trade. There's a book called The Horizon History of Africa. There's an 8th chapter called The Coming of the Europeans, when Abu-Boad, the Ghanaian historian, tells you what happened before the Europeans got there and the consequences of the Europeans being there. The 8th chapter is again written by me. Africa, time of trouble. The impact of the Europeans all over Africa as they move. The impact and the negative impact at that. Now, when the Europeans began to grow weary of the rationales they had developed to justify the slave trade, a number of Europeans began to write the real truth. An Englishman named Blake, wrote a long work on the history of slavery, not the history of African slavery, but the history of slavery in the whole world. And at the best chapter on Hebrew slavery I've ever read. Most people assume there was no Hebrew slavery. Slavery has touched every people one way or the other, sometime or the other, on the face of the earth. So a new literature was coming out of Europe concurrent with the ending of the slave trade. The slave trade did not end because anyone loved anyone. it became an unwieldy system. It was no longer practical. Now, the British, who had controlled that business for over 300 years, began to lose control. Then they began to get a fake reputation as abolitionists. And most of the British abolitionists were phony, including the best known, Granville Sharp and Wilberforce. Clarkston had a semblance of democracy and wrote the governments in Haiti, offering his service on how to structure a democratic state. When Christophe did not want a democratic state in the European sense at all, Christophe was controlling one part of the island. And while it wasn't democratic, everybody was eating and everybody was working. Patton, a mulatto, was controlling another part of the island. Super democratic, but everybody was hungry. And when Patton faced Christophe, who had been a stable boy and a head waiter at an inn, he said that had the French killed you when you were in their service, I wouldn't have you to contend with. Christophe's answer was cutting and maybe unfair, but it was brutally true. He said he looked at his mulatto adversary and said that if your mother had the common decency to keep Frenchmen out of her bed, I wouldn't have you to contend with. But I'm saying that at this turning point in history, there was a turning point in literature. Flanders Petrie was writing his 6-volume History of Egypt. People were following, other Frenchmen followed Count Bonise. 2 great French translators began to translate African material into French, Deslaine and Houdin. All of this was now introducing Africa more and more to the rest of the world. In the closing years of the 19th century, an English woman, Flora Shaw, went out to Nigeria to write a series of articles justifying the British takeover of Nigeria. She knew some Indo-European languages, few Indo-African languages. She began to research, to write a preface on African independent states before the coming of the Europeans. The material she uncovered for the preface was so good, the material for the preface became the book. It is probably the best book written about Africa early in the 20th century. It's called A Tropical Dependency. In the middle of the 19th century, Europeans began to wonder, especially the English, whether it would be more profitable to enter into honorable commercial trade with Africa other than the slave trade. So they sent out to Africa the British Inter-African Exploration Expedition. They were short of money and they wanted one man who could do all things, a botanist, a draftsman, and a linguist. So they found a hardy young fellow in Germany, Henrik. Many of the Englishmen died of diseases, snake bites. This hardy German didn't get a scratch. And because he could read Arabic, and a lot of Africans were in inner Western Africa used Arabic at the time, he went through asking for the two tarikhs, or the histories. Finally, one MR told the naive little fellow that we don't sell books. Once you own a book, you keep it. You permit certain people to read it. And you permit your friends to come in and read your book. And you read your books to friends, but you don't sell books. Books were a sacred thing. So he let Henrik read the tarikhs, or the local histories. Henrik put all of this together in a digest of his 3-volume work, Travels and Discoveries in North and in Central Africa. maybe the best book written on Africa in the 19th century, and the clearest book written on Africa in the 19th century. After this, there was a French expedition. They wanted to discover they too wanted to discover inner Africa. Bach's book was published in an edition of 500, the Temple edition, which is almost impossible to find right now. That was the 5-volume edition. But at the end of the 19th century, there was other curious people the French wanted to see if they could deal in commercial goods with Africans other than the slaves. They offered a reward for the first person who would go and discover the city of Timbuktu. A young Frenchman whose father had been a baker, had paid much attention to his education, René Salien, he went out disguised as an Arab. He went through all of the African countries. He discovered the great trade routes and wrote his report. His report is called The Unveiling of Timbuktu. He was telling the Europeans something, a lot of people have told the Europeans something that is hard for you to believe right now. The slave trade was not necessary. All those millions of people who are dead didn't have to die, because the European could have engaged in honorable trade. They not only would have gotten trade, they could have gotten labor on a contract basis. No, they wanted everything, and they began to spoil everything. Okay, now, that 19th century led to the opening of the 20th century, and in the 20th century, we had several people to preserve African history and to read material written in the 19th century. It was only in the 20th century we began to read the great German writer A.E. Heru, a 6-volume work on Africa, the 4th volume called A History of the Trade and the Commercial Intercourse between the Egyptians, the Ethiopians, and the Carthaginians. The whole 6 volumes are devoted to a history of the Africans in the economic history of the ancient world. But that 4th volume is devoted to Africa. Now General Massey, a British agnostic, something most people who read Massey do not understand. Massey said that all European religions were taken from Africa, including the Trinity, including the ornaments in the Catholic Church. All taken from Africa. So he set out to prove that, so he had to learn a whole lot of Africa while he was doing it. Devote 40 years to 6-volume work, still a great masterpiece that ends forever any idea that Egypt was anything other than Africa. First 2 volumes, Egypt, Light of the World. Second 2 volumes, Natural Genesis. The 3rd, the Book of the Beginning. Now from Germany, you had 3 master writers and preservers. Herein the first, the second, Henrik, the third, Leo Frobenius. From the French, you had several master writers, but the person who put the most on paper, Maurice de la Fosse. And the person who wrote an early history of Nigeria before it became Nigeria, Lieutenant Louis Diplom. And his work is called The High Senegal Niger. Leo Frobenius wrote a 5-volume history of African civilization condensed into 2 volumes called The Voice of Africa. I am saying concurrent with the attempt to justify colonialism, there were intellects in Europe began to do business.
and began to be honest about African history in a way that a whole lot of people are not willing to be honest about it today. These people and the reading of their work by radical blacks led to the emergence of men like Carter G. Woodson, who founded the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, now Afro-American Life and History. Led to the radical journalists like T. Thomas Fortune and William Monroe Trotter. Led to the writings of the greatest black historical statisticians that we have produced in this country. Monroe work of Tuskegee Institute, who used to edit the so-called Negro yearbook. I am showing that it was the reading of radical historians, white historians, that set the black historians in motion. They never denied this, but they were never able to point to the fact that these historians set them in motion. From Europe again would come men like Maspero, his 2-volume work. Another one of the Smith brothers who wrote about 6 volumes on different aspects of Africa. Anacalypsis, written by an Englishman, written in the 19th century, read in the 20th century. A history of the dispersion of African people throughout the world. Father Williams' excellent work, Hebrewisms of West Africa, tracing the concept of Hebrewism and what you know as the Jewish faith to its African base, and how that religion spread in the Western world without the assistance of any converted Jews or without any assistance of any Europeans. Also dealing with the dispersion of Jewish people after the Romans destroyed their last temple, and many of them went down into Africa. Very few went to Europe. The European historian is a convert. He was converted later. Ethnically, he had no relationship to the biblical Jew. My main point is that these white preservers helped to bring into being black preservers. And these key black preservers, William Leo Hansberry, Woodson, whose excellent work, African Background Outlines, still need to be read. William Leo Hansberry, who taught African history for 37 years at Howard University, the finest Africanists we produced in the Western world. All of this came together in the 20s. Someone put a name on the movement, and they call it the Harlem Literary Renaissance. It was a movement of self-discovery. It was a movement when we were saying in a different way, with different words, we're black and we're beautiful. When we were discovering that one day we rule nations, and we'll rule nations again. We heard a Marcus Garvey message that the Jamaicans didn't hear when he was living in Jamaica and won't hear now if he was alive. Not because they were Jamaicans, but they had the semblance of a state. And they assumed that you don't have to preach statehood to me, I've already got one. When you preach statehood to the black American who hasn't got one, he's going to listen. And he did listen. And made it one of the largest movements in history. This inquiry about our history, and this looking at the neglected people who preserved our history, and the unnecessary fuss you're making over Jesse Jackson's suggestion we be called Africans. I side with the little boredom, although I like Jesse. So what else is new? Our historians have been trying to do this for 200 years. We haven't paid the slightest bit of attention to them. Edmund Blyden, in his inaugural address at Liberia College in 1881, said that. William Wells Brown, our first novelist, said that in his work. Martin Delany said the same thing. The great Jamaican
Robert Campbell, who accompanied the natives in search of a place for settlement, said the same thing in his work, Pilgrimage to My Motherland. Raphael Powell, in 1927, wrote a work called The Human Side of a People in Their Right Name. And the book has been republished, and I saw Raphael Powell last week, almost 90 years old or over, walking around Harlem, proud Jamaican, one pressed black suit in the winter, one pressed Palm Beach suit in the summer. Yet a man who looks impeccable. People don't know that, except for Social Security, he'd be starved. People walk by, don't know that Raphael is one of our finest scholars. He's written 8 books. His best known book is The Human Side of a People in Their Right Name. And he was the one to take up the idea of the word Negro and to dismiss this word and say that sometimes a misnamed people is a misdirected people. We are a people who many times come to many crossroads and fail to see the literature produced for us by us. We have not yet read Richard B. Moore's little book, The Name Negro, Its Origin and Evil Use. And in this book he says slaves and dogs are named by their masters, free men name themselves. The proper name of a people must always relate to land, history, and culture. And anytime you call a people by a name that fails to relate to land, history, and culture, you have called them out of their name. When we are a people at the crossroads of our history, we see many road signs. We see a road sign marked color. We can't go down that road. We see a road sign marked Negro. We can't go down that road because there's no such thing. We see a road sign marked black. We can't go down that road because that tells you how you look, but it don't tell you who you are.